Right, I want to take a look here at the 2019 AP Macro question number 3. This is from set number 2. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so here's the question. Let's set it up. We've got two countries, Sweden and Norway, use equal quantities of resources to produce food and capital goods. The table below shows the maximum possible production of food or capital goods for each industry or for each country. So we have a PPC that we're setting up here, and you have the table there that tells you how much of each good each country produces. You see that right here. And then, so let's look quickly, because parts A and B are going to be essentially on the same graph here. So part A is draw a correctly labeled graph of the PPC curve for Sweden. All right, so we don't have to worry about Norway. They just want to ask about Sweden. But it's good practice if you draw them both. But place food on the horizontal axis and capital goods on the vertical axis, and then plot the relevant numerical values. So really part A is just asking for a PPC curve for one of the countries, for Sweden. And then if you look in part B, looking ahead on your graph, indicate the following. So they want 3 different points here, right? One labeled E, that is efficient, one that is inefficient, labeled I, and then an unattainable, labeled U on the graph. So this is all going to be done on our PPC graph. So let me all right, let's just go here. So let me erase. All right, so I'm going to just draw a giant PPC here. Since it's for parts A and B. All right, so they wanted capital goods up here. And our other goods, food, down here on the x-axis. Okay, so if you look back to the question, the table, so we're looking at, and this is for Sweden. They only asked about one of the countries, so we don't have to worry about the other one. So if you look at the chart for Sweden, you see how many capital goods, if they were to focus all their energy on producing capital goods, they could have done 100 units of capital goods. And flip that, if they spent all their energy producing only food, the maximum they could produce is 50, right? So that's the trade-off is a line between, and this is your PPC curve for Sweden, right? And you'd approach it the same way if you had to do one for Norway as well. You just use the different numbers that they would be able to produce of each good. Okay, now, so that's part A, correctly labeled PPC curve. Part B asks for the 3 different points. So we know anything that's on the line is going to be an efficient use of our resources, right? So that was the first one. That's pretty straightforward. Now, you could also make this connection. An efficient point is also where an economy is at full employment, right? So if you connected a question like this to, maybe a recessionary gap type question, you may have to think about it from a different perspective, right? So in that case, if we're not utilizing all our resources, we are inefficient, right? So let's draw some point down here. They wanted us to label it I, so we know we're inside the curve here, right? So we're not producing as much as we could because we're not utilizing all our resources. So that's akin to a recessionary gap, right? And then the last point they wanted you to draw was unattainable, right? And they wanted us to label it EU. And that will be outside the curve because the country, in this case, Sweden, cannot produce at that point in any way, shape, or form. Countries can experience gains from trade, and that's the only way that they could consume some bundle beyond their PPC curve. All right, so that's our graphs from part A and B. Okay, so let's go to question C. So question C is going to ask us, we're really not going to have to do much. It's really more of the logic question here. Assume Sweden moves from producing 20 units of food and 60 units of capital goods to producing 30 units of food and 40 units of capital goods. What will happen to economic growth in Sweden in the future? All right, well, I need my pen back here. Okay. So what we notice here, we went from producing 60 units of capital goods to producing 40 units of capital goods. All right, so that's what you really need to focus on in answering this question. Anytime you think about economic growth, especially future, right? Future economic growth comes through investment, right? Through investment in capital goods. Sometimes that's termed capital formation. Think about, instead of just this term capital goods, let's think about factories, right? Well, what's going to happen if we invest in 60 factories per year, right? So the next year, presumably these are good investment factories, right? They're able to produce more than their investment takes, but all of a sudden we go from 60 factories down to now 40, right, over here. So we're investing less, right? So in the future, our economic growth rate is going to slow down, right? You can't grow as fast as if you're producing less capital goods. So I want you to make sure that you connect these words, right? Capital goods, economic growth, and the other word that's important that you can use to describe this is capital formation. And I always find it's the easiest to think about capital or investments. Think about it intuitively as factories, right? So if we're building less factories, eventually we're not going to be able to keep pace with that sort of economic growth, right? So it doesn't mean economic growth is negative; it just means it's not growing as quickly, right? So the economic growth, they should say rate in here, right? The rate is slowing or decreasing in some way. So your answer here, because they ask what will happen to economic growth, you should say that economic growth in the future will be reduced or slow down, some phrase of that manner. All right, so let me erase this. Let's go to part D. And this is a comparative advantage problem, right? So we have to calculate, and they ask specifically about only one of the goods, but we'll go through and calculate the opportunity cost for both goods, just because I think it's worthwhile being comfortable and knowing how to do that. So comparative advantage is, so you have to calculate the opportunity cost for each one. So I'm going to do this over here. So for Sweden, let's go like this. Opportunity cost of food and opportunity capital goods. All right, so we want to know an opportunity cost is how much you have to give up in order to get the other thing. And sometimes if I get confused on these, it's helpful to draw the PPC curve. So let's redraw that. So that was 100, and this is 50. So you're really asking, what is the slope there, right? What do you have to give up in order to get more production of the other thing? And that's what we talk about. The opportunity cost of food is the amount you have to give up of the other good, in this case, capital goods, to get one more unit of food, right? So what we do here for the opportunity cost of food, you take how many are in the opposite, right? So 100, and then we got to divide it by 50, right? So in this case, our opportunity cost is 2. Now this makes sense, right? The capital goods up here is double, right, at our maximum, right? So if we had 50 food, we'd have to give up 100, right? So you got to sort of divide that there. So, and then if you flip it for the other good, you know that these are the reciprocal, right? You're on the other side, and then you're doing it the other way. So we can fill that one in right now. that should be 1/2, right? Now this is capital goods, and this is food. It's always in terms of the opposite good. All right, so now this question, we have to go calculate Norway. Okay, so same way, same thing. We're going to start with the opportunity cost of food for Norway. We have different numbers here, so this is going to be 120 over 30. Okay, for capital goods. And flip it, right? So it would be 30 over 120, so reciprocal, right? 1/4 unit of food. Okay, sorry, it's kind of hard to see that over there. So the question, let's go back to the question now. So we calculated our opportunity costs, and they're asking about capital goods. So who has the comparative advantage? All right, not absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is who can produce more, right? So in this case, absolute advantage would go to, for capital goods, would go to Norway because they can produce more. That's not what we're asking here. We don't need to address that. We're asking about comparative advantage, right? Who has a lower opportunity cost? So for capital goods, it's hard to see. So the opportunity cost here for Sweden is 1/2 unit of food, and the opportunity cost for Norway is 1/4 unit of food, right? 1/4 is less than 1/2. So Norway. And the explanation, I would go through and we did these calculations, and we would say Norway because their opportunity cost is only 1/4 unit of food, and 1/4 is less than 1/2, right? So they have a lower opportunity cost than Sweden. Therefore, Norway has the comparative advantage, right? Some concise explanation there, just a sentence or maybe two. Okay, so that's comparative advantage. And then part E, based on the table above, identify a specific number of units of capital goods that could be traded for 10 units of food and be mutually beneficial. So this is a terms of trade question. And it's sort of an odd question because they ask for a specific number when actually terms of trade is generally a range. So I'm going to talk about the range, and then essentially you could pick any number in between there. So how do we figure out what's mutually beneficial? Well, so let's first of all, and they also throw you 10 units here. So 1 unit of food, the question would be what would be advantageous to both sides to trade that for? So if you look at the opportunity cost of food, so let's look over here in this column. Anywhere in between those two opportunity costs, so we've got 2 and 4 capital goods here, anywhere in between those would be mutually beneficial, right? So if you think about it in terms of a range, 1 food is going to be equal to anywhere between 2 and 4 capital goods. Now, if you went through each scenario there, 2 versus 4, you could do the math and figure out, well, they could even, each of those scenarios would be advantageous. Now, where they actually end up in terms of negotiations, right, it depends on the people who's negotiating, those sorts of things. So the actual, number that we're going to land on, but this is the range. It's going to be somewhere in between. So don't forget, though, that they throw 10 units, right? So you got to multiply all this by times 10. So your final answer, should be somewhere, some number anywhere between 20 and 40 capital goods. All right. Again, I think, well, it just says identify. So I still feel more comfortable if you actually show the math to this one, but that's your range for terms of trade.